for tomorrow.
Yeah. And I'll
Okay,
edit the next one.
that's cool. I can
I think it's setting
record.
up. Oh, I gotta go.
Okay. Do you have the live pulled up? I'll do that right now.
I do.
Okay, let me grab that. Got it.
Should we just go? Or
Yeah.
should we wait a minute?
Let's go.
Okay. Welcome to Perfect Organism, the Alien Saga podcast, everyone. I am your host, Jamie Prater, and I'm joined by my co-host.
Patrick Green, fresh out of the shower with a coffee in my hand because we're recording in the morning again, and I'm trying to get used to it. How's it going,
Indeed,
man?
indeed. It's going well. It's going well. It's a nice sunny day here in England. Just enjoying the day. It's a little bit chilly. For me, it's chilly. For them, it's still hot, but it's in the 60s. But yeah,
That
lovely
is
day.
pretty chilly, all things considered. Yeah, it's
Mm,
finally back into the 70s over here on the east coast of the U.S., which is nice. The summer's been absolutely incredibly
yeah,
hot.
so I've heard.
Let's do some Patreon shout outs. Again, if you want to
Let's
join
do it.
these people, go to perfectorganism.com/support. Or you can go ahead and search for us on Patreon. We have lots of cool stuff coming up, and it's also a great way to get ad-free listening. I gotta say, sometimes I forget, which one I'm listening to in my Apple Podcasts app, and I'll listen to the one that has the ads in it, and I'm like, whoa, my God, there's all these things that we have air conditioning ads and like Tylenol ads. I'm like, oh man. So if you don't want that, although we're grateful for the ads because they do support the show, but if you would like to support us in a slightly more direct way, you can get ad free listening through our Patreon, as well as tons of exclusive shows, including a really awesome one that Holden just uploaded on the Halo series. We're doing game rates now, so lots of game content as well as frame rates, as well as Sublime Noise, which we're supposed to get back to the summer and we didn't, but we're gonna get back to it. Anyway,
We'll
let's go
see.
back to we will. Let's go back a couple months here. We got Shora Multivac, Andrew Tracy, Zachary Eastrom, Larry Wood, Nick, Tom Goddard, Big Hippie, Stefan Calderon, and Chase Paquin, who just joined. Thank you guys so much. The producers will all get a shout out at the end of the episode, as always, and I'll hand it back over to Jamie.
Thanks, Patrick. So we are here today to discuss something a little controversial, but it was Patrick's idea, and I'm all for it. And is essentially the suggestion that perhaps Alien 3 was a mistake. But so when you floated this idea, my first question is, are you this is couched in the sense of it was a mistake, perhaps a mistake for Fox to make this film, correct?
I really mean it, as broadly as possible. And something that I'm noticing when I'll post like a question to like our socials, if I keep it as kind of high level as possible, the conversation always goes in neat directions. So that's why when I pose this to you, I was like, was Alien 3 a mistake? Right. And you could take that in whatever way you want to take it. Part of this is inspired by the fact that this is something that we hear from people quite a bit when we do Alien 3 content. And it's also coming from a sense that, you and I obviously adore Alien 3, and I don't think it's a spoiler to say that you and I will come out of this conversation not thinking it's a mistake because it's one of our favorite movies of all time. But it's a question worth interrogating because it's something that resonates with a lot of fans. And I look back at the complicated history that Alien has had, especially since 1992, and I can't help but wonder if Alien Three's existence has something to do with that, whether it's thematically, whether it's in terms of box office decisions. Uh, Alien 3 continues to be an incredibly complicated monster to unpack, and that's kind of what I was thinking when I posed this.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. Honestly, I've been thinking a lot about Alien 3 as we have been watching the news about Alien Romulus, the sequel, and the fallout from that, and just the behind the scenes chaos. And like this person wants this, and this person doesn't want this, and then they have this writer. Now they have this writer. Maybe it's this person. They left for this reason. Maybe it wasn't for this reason. And it's just this ongoing thing. And I feel like in some ways the IP is cursed, and that curse started with Alien 3. Um, and of course, Alien 3, as you know, as we know, that went through what, 12 different drafts before they even settled on it. In fact, they started shooting the film while the script wasn't even finalized, while they were getting pages overnight. And in some ways, when films are being shot, there are updates and what do you call it? Additions added and things like that. That's just kind of a normal thing when movies are in the middle of production. But with Alien 3, it was a whole different thing. I mean, the whole script was being rehabbed on the spot days before. Sometimes they were waiting on pages or waiting on dialogue or waiting on rewrites and that
Yeah, I was
kind of a
gonna say it
thing.
wasn't even days before a lot of the time. A lot of time it was
Yeah.
during the shoot.
Yes.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I think part of where I'm coming from is also just looking at the current state of events and thinking back to like, so for example, you go back to Aliens. Like Ridley was never doing a sequel, at that point in time. Like there was never a conversation about that. James Cameron came with, this, he was approached obviously by like Geiler and Hill, had this wonderful idea. And then he made this thing that was this masterpiece that worked better than any other film in the franchise has in terms of universal acclaim, critically, and universal success in terms of the box office and popular culture. And it was just this complete juggernaut. And then Alien 3 is where the whole saga took a very interesting turn. And I think in terms of like its at least financial success, not a great one. In that, for one thing, obviously it wasn't like a huge financial hit, but it also set up the pattern that we're still really living through, which is that every Alien film feels very different. Like we get, new characters, new setting, new tone, new vibe. And it would have been, I think, in most universes, and especially in the universe we're living in now, it would have made a lot more sense for them just to make like, let's do another Aliens film, like let's just have James Cameron come back and do another space, battle marine, gung ho, like exciting, crowd pleasing, hope filled, box office pleasing thing. And instead we got this really dark, poetic, strange, challenging film. And I mean, you look at the very first comment in our live stream today, which is from Blick 7450, who says that they hated that they killed Hicks and Newt, but still like the film. I mean, that is or Christian Perez right there, personally killing Newt and Hicks and Bishop was the greatest sin ever done to the aliens' legacy. That comes up every single time this film comes up. There is
Mhm.
still active pain about, especially Newt and Hicks being killed off at the beginning of the movie. And I obviously very much get that. And I also think that it was just an incredibly wild thing to do, right? To not only say we're not going to continue what Cameron did with Aliens, but to like literally kill off 2/3 of like the principles that we're carrying over from that film. I mean, it was such a middle finger to what Aliens had represented. And I think in some ways, the franchise has never quite gotten back to that sense of like carryover stability where we have arcs that continue across time and characters that survive between films. um Something that with Romulus 2 we've been talking about a lot is this idea that like we're assuming that Rain and Andy's story would continue because that's apparently what Fede and Gato Olivares had decided. And it felt very much like the end of Romulus was setting us up for that, right? And then now, of course, we're thrust back into this place where we're like, well, is that even going to happen? Is it not? And I just feel like conversations like that wouldn't even be happening had Alien 3 not happened and just murdered, a lot of very beloved people right at the start of the film.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. And I think as you were talking, I'm also thinking what happened between Alien and Aliens was that Aliens was not just an amazing film, but it was amazing as commerce as well. Alien Aliens made Alien even more profitable. I mean, the first Alien was very profitable as a feature, but it was also very art house. But it changed the genre, much like Blade Runner changed the genre as well, for science fiction. And I almost think that Alien 3's mistake was perhaps killing off Newton Hicks. The question then begs, do they all wake up and just have another adventure? What to what end? Maybe, but I think maybe it would have been easier if they would have perhaps killed them off, given them 20, 25, 30 minutes of screen time, and then they're killed off. And then Ripley is on her own again. I think what the slap in the face was is these are fridged deaths. And this, we've discussed this before in our Blade Runner podcast. Fridging is something that happens most of the time with female characters in sequels, but it happened with Newt and with Hicks. And two of the most loved characters in this franchise were fridged. not just Fridge, killed horribly off screen. Well, at least Hicks was. Newt just, died from drowning essentially in her fluid from her own lungs. And I think that's the slap in the face. I think people are a little bit more at peace with their deaths, but it was the way that they were killed that's upsetting to them.
Yeah, and knowing the background on that, right, which of course that Vincent Ward was just like, well, I don't fucking care, like let's just start over again. There was like a fundamental disrespect there as well, right?
Mm,
And I think it's easy to pile on with this conversation because Newton Hicks are two of, my favorite characters as well, and I think it goes without saying that we were all devastated about that, when we saw this. Um, and still are. But the truth is it also kept the Alien series from going in that direction that you were kind of talking about, which is, easy money, right? Is that a bad thing or is it a good thing? That's the other question I think is like, is it better to have challenging art that does not always land with people than it is to have commercially profitable art that lands with just a kind of wide majority of the film going public? I think as an Alien fan, I honestly would say the former. Like I would rather have art that is kind of hard and it doesn't always make a ton of money, but means a lot to people who kind of vibe with it. And again, I'm setting up this false dichotomy. Obviously, that doesn't have to be like it doesn't have to always be one or the other, where you can either have success or you can make art, right? Obviously, that goes without saying. Aliens is a great example of how you can have both, right? But I mean, so say nukes and hit nuke I forgot it's so early. Newton Hicks survive Alien 3, then do they and survive the rest of the film, like then what happens, right? Like then are we 4 movies in where we have this like nuclear family going, and would that have been better maybe for continuity's sake? Something I hadn't even really considered until you brought it up was like what if they had died, a third or two-thirds into the film and they had actual screen time, Michael and Carrie. Um, would that have landed better or worse with people? I would have to think better. I do think part of why Alien 3 continues to be a struggle for people is because of the way in which they were killed and the way that they were fridged
mm.
off screen and the fact that it felt kind of disrespectful. But yeah, it's an interesting theory to think about like what if they had made it?
Yeah, because we've discussed this before. In Aliens, all of these beloved characters die on screen. Hicks, Vasquez, or sorry, Hudson, Vasquez, Gorman. Not that Gorman was necessarily beloved, but these characters that we really bonded with, like Apone, like Frost, all of them die, and we're okay with that. But their deaths are earned. They're earned by the writing. They're earned as an audience participating. That they went out in a blaze of glory. They went out essentially as heroes, as opposed to them going out in, Hicks and Newt going out in just, I guess it could be seen as laziness, like, oh, let's just kill them. But also knowing who David Fincher is as a filmmaker, and that was his first feature film. And if you see his films after, Hicks and Newt's death in Alien 3 lines up perfectly with how Fincher deals with violence and death. Hold on one second, I have to cough. Um, so I don't think Hicks and Newt's death is lazy, but I think to a fandom that has bonded so heavily with them, it needed something different. It just really did. And I don't know what that is, but pardon me. Then again, I'm reading some of the comments that people think that Alien 3 is the dark heart of Aliens, of the saga. Hold on, I have to cough again. I'm sorry. Sorry about that all. Um, And I do believe that Ripley's depth, the depth of her story, the depth of her journey really becomes that at the end of Alien 3 when we hear her last, the last message she sent out in Alien, like, with a little luck, the network will pick me up, and we hear it in a ghostly way, and we see the EEV covered, and it's just beautiful. It's poetic. And Alien 3 is high art. I would say I would equate Alien 3 on the level of Blade Runner 2049, cerebral, minimalist in some ways, lonely, dealing with loneliness, dealing with some very different films, but in terms of its maybe ephemeral substance, they deal with similar ideas.
And color palette.
Um, yeah, yeah,
They're
for
both
sure,
very
color.
brown and amber, you know? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Although I would say 2049 goes the gambit of colors, depending on what scene you're watching.
That's true. Yeah, that's
Um,
true.
but yeah, I don't know. I think Alien 3 serves Alien better than Aliens does. Alien 3 takes it back to the cerebral quality, the quiet, the dark, not a lot of talking, and I think that is on its face, it's a triumph. But what happened was, or is, it's too late. Aliens had already become commerce. Aliens had already become a summer blockbuster, crowd pleaser, pleasing everyone. And then you do this film that pleases very few people. I think it's a damneder you do if you're damneder you don't. However, if they would have went with Vincent Ward's original idea of a wooden world won by monks, Hicks and Newt could have lived in that world because they're monks, they're not prisoners, it's a different kind of people. They've made vows of celibacy, but they're not criminals, they're not rapists, they're not killers. And Hicks and Newt could have lived within that. And I think that might have been the better decision to go with that story so that these characters could live and maybe wake up Ripley earlier because in that script, of course, she's asleep for a long time or comatose or whatever in cryo. So yeah, it's a complicated discussion.
Yeah, something that's coming up also in the chat quite a bit is the idea that we're lucky that we didn't end up with this like happy nuclear family story. I gotta say, like, as we're talking, I'm thinking it didn't necessarily have to be that. I mean, I frequently brought that up on this show as well, where I'm like, oh, the loss is important, the sense that like this family is fragmented is important. And if they all survive and we get happy endings, then like we haven't earned, anything, or Ripley hasn't really completed her hero's arc. But that's kind of that's kind of assuming that these characters were going to get out unscathed, right? I think a really sophisticated film, which I think would have been basically impossible to make at that point, given the amount of rewrites that Alien 3 was going through, but a really sophisticated film that had been imagined from the beginning with Newton and Hicks's deaths as part of the script, which of course was not the way that Alien 3 was originally written. A really thoughtful one maybe would have dealt with the emotional fallout of aliens in a really interesting way. I mean, Newt is carrying so much, PTSD, right, from what happened. I would have to assume. I mean, we see her, really struggling with it in Aliens a lot. But I mean, imagine like she grows up a little bit, she becomes a teenager, she's really repressed a lot of these things, and they're kind of coming out, and they're really affecting her emotional life. And Hicks, we end the film with him being effectively disabled. Like he's just sitting in the ship smoking, like physically smoking. Uh, what if like he survived but with lifelong disabilities? Like what if he had brain damage or something and he was, some sort of a persistent vegetative state, or couldn't, move, couldn't be the soldier that he had been, couldn't be the grunt that he had kind of defined himself as, and instead had to find, deeper wells of strength within himself in other ways. Um, there's a lot of ways that like they could have survived, and I think it could have still meant something. Like I don't think that if Newt survived, she would have necessarily just glommed onto Ripley as her, mom forever, where everything's normal and everything's fine, and her previous life didn't really exist. I think Newt would have had to really deal with losing the rest of the Jordan family and her colonist friends, and I think that would have been really traumatizing for her. And I think something that's cool about Hicks's journey is we see that his like warrior ability has kind of been stripped from him by the end of the film, and him dealing with that would have also been interesting. Like, who is he if he can't define himself the way that he once did? But then again, that's also a lot to cram into a movie that is, as already as packed as Alien 3 is with character development and with things going on. So then it becomes this issue of like, well, then did they get sidelined? Like, would Alien 3 have worked better had Newton Hicks been, rerouted or something, and Ripley had been on a separate, lander and blah blah blah. I mean, there's other ways perhaps that it could have happened that might have felt like that did more justice to Newton Hicks. But even as I'm saying this, I'm realizing that like Newton Hicks's deaths are important because they are the I think the best expression in the whole Alien franchise of the nihilism, or of the dark truth at the heart of all of this. that the universe is vast and cold, and the universe is not happy with easy answers. And in Alien, we have a lot of death and we have a lot of struggle and a lot of incredibly terrifying things, but Ripley does make it. She's able to rescue Jones. There's a sense of like triumph, even in spite of loss in that. And then in Aliens, of course, it feels ultimately to me very triumphant, because we end the film even with all of the death, but we end the film with a sense of like, okay, we beat the dark heart of the universe back. And then we get Alien 3, and it's this ontological, deep study about what it what where do we find meaning when meaning has been stripped from us, right? um Ripley goes into Alien 3 feeling in a lot of ways activated, because she gets to be a mother again. Like, she gets that sense of getting to care and getting to be a protector, and then she loses that, and that loss is similar to what I was saying about Hicks, about being stripped of his identity. It's like, then who is she if that has also been taken from her again? And not even taken from her by a person, but taken from her by a company, taken from her by this nihilistic core at the center of the universe. And Alien 3, like, by not romanticizing their deaths, or by not giving their deaths like a tremendous amount of meaning outside of like the bear, the cremation sequence, I think it's kind of expressing that in a really eloquent and really difficult way.
Yeah, I'm 100% agreeing with you. Again, this is a complicated discussion because I also think the setup for this is difficult. In terms of what aliens did. I think you how do you compete with that? And also, when you approach a sequel, a lot of times when sequels come out, people are like, "Is it better than the first one? Is it as good as the first one?" As opposed to, I don't think that's what sequels should do. Sequels shouldn't set out to be better than or as good as. They need to work on their own merits, and that's a hard thing to do in the Alien series, to have something work on its own merits, because everyone goes back to aliens or alien. And Alien 3 in some ways is really truly
I think we
Alien
do, but
3.
I don't think the general public
I would agree with
thinks
you in
that at
general,
all.
but I think in fandom there is this slow burn, people coming into love for Alien 3 and
Yeah, for sure.
understanding what it's done for just the IP in general. Um, but I also think in terms of Alien 3 being a mistake, part of the mistake was that you had 4,000 producers all wanting a finger into what that story was going to be. Producer after producer after producer. And that has plagued Alien even during the sale of Fox to Disney. You have so many producers involved. Everyone has their own idea, but it really gets back to commerce and these films needing to be business models before their art. I think the studio, when Alien was released, the studio was really, the studios back then at the time, we were going through this big, like, verite cinema style, it was very documentary style way of making movies, and Alien fit that mold beautifully. And Aliens does that a little bit as well, but of course it's many years later, post Vietnam War. It has some things to say about that. It's not, James Cameron wasn't interested in the the tonal way that Ridley Scott told Alien. I think he was like, I'm doing something different. This is going to be a, like, balls to the wall, super firepower, like Marines and tech and guns and all of that. Whereas that's not the film Ridley Scott made at all. Alien began as an art film. The IP began as an art film, and that art film terrorized people. That art film came out around the time of The Exorcist, when films were doing things in theaters that no one had seen before. They were terrifying people in theaters in ways people had not been scared of before. There's a tonal symmetry between The Exorcist and Alien in terms of that dread, that slow dread where something's coming. There's just something in the air and you can feel it, you can sense it. Even though we're watching something, you can just sense it. The
And
same as
that
with,
sense of realism too. I think a,
yes,
a big reason why The Exorcist endures is because it takes this really fantastical setting, but it really talks a lot about the actual emotional grief and trauma and fallout something like that would cause, and it gives it
yeah,
a lot of that cinema verite feel of like we're seeing the internal lives of these characters external, right?
yeah. And so this is the setup for these films. And so then I don't know. I honestly don't know what they could have done different. I mean, we're speculating what they could have done different. They could have made Vincent Ward's script. Um, but I also think what the mistake of Alien 3 wasn't so much the story that we saw, it might have been the mechanics of their death. But I also think these films are also about loss, the original trilogy that had the original trilogy of films really had direction. It had focus. It had determination. Ripley was at the center of these stories. These are we. There's a reason why we call these films the Ripley timeline, because she's the central story. And then Prometheus comes around in 2012, and it stops being about a central character for the most part, and is a film about ideas, which is also interesting. And then by the end of Prometheus, is the film about Shaw. Sort of it is. It becomes a film about Shaw, much like Alien was not a film about Ripley when it began, but by the end of it, it became a film about Ripley. So I could see what Ridley Scott was doing there with Prometheus. Unfortunately, with Prometheus, it was written terribly, with amazing, ideas going on in there, and we've had that discussion many, many times. But this is the setup for these films. So Alien 3 was going to be damned if you do, damned if you don't. Now, if Alien 3 would have been Ripley and Newt wake up somewhere. There's another alien threat and they battle it. Would that have been fun? Sure, but it really would have depended on how they ended the film. Honestly, the ending of the film would just have like I think someone probably needed to die. I think if these films were just give the audience what they want, we wouldn't, someone I think it was say 400 said in the chat that this podcast was probably would not be here now if not for Alien 3. And I think that that's true. And like Alien 3, when I met the film at 16, I was going through some really intense things in my life, some real darkness. And Alien 3 really spoke to that darkness. And it's because I can pivot from those experiences that I have things to say. And if it would have ended on this another like repackaged film like Avatar, the Avatar films, where it's essentially the story repackaged to us again. I don't know if it would have last. I don't know if it would last the test of time.
Right. And I think a great case study in that to a degree is Romulus, right? Which came out and kind of gave us that. It gave us like a return to the first film and the second film to a degree where we were able to kind of, predict some things that happened and it felt very comfortable and felt very beautiful and felt very appropriately alien. And yet it's not something that we really interrogate the philosophical landscape of too much, right? Romulus is wonderful, but I don't think it's a film that you could sustain a whole podcast about. Like I think that a podcast writ large. I think that Alien 3 is, to Save's point, I think a really big reason why we're here right now. I think that Alien 3 presents us with like the case that Alien can really be art in the long term, that it could be difficult and challenging and hold a mirror up to society and also challenge what we are assuming will happen so that it doesn't fall into the trap that befalls other things like Star Wars and Star Trek and these franchises where you really kind of know what you're going to get when you sit down in the theater. That also, I think, has kind of bitten us in the ass a little bit over the decades because Alien 3 also did something else, right? So you have Ridley was not the first choice for Alien, famously, right? Like the Duelists kind of won the studio over and they had considered other people and they approached him and he kind of got the bid. Uh, Cameron was selected, like they sought James Cameron out because of the Terminator script for Aliens. So Cameron was like found in the rough. And Cameron, therefore, was not, it didn't have this feeling of like, oh, Alien is my favorite thing of all time. I need to do justice to it. He just wanted to make a movie within that universe that worked really well. And so I think he had a lot of freedom and latitude to kind of do whatever he wanted with it. So then it would have been, this is like where that dichotomy happens. Because had they continued doing that, like had they continued just sort of hiring somebody who was like a hot, bankable talent, who was not intimately personally connected to the franchise, we could have kind of seen it go in that direction where we have a lot of things that maybe, well, I don't know. I guess what I'm trying to say is then after that we have, of course, like Fincher, who was like the 35th choice to direct Alien 3, right? Who was brought in, like way at the end of this process after so many other things had already happened and was chosen based kind of like Scott on his experience with non-long form film. Scott, of course, doing a lot of commercial work in music videos and things, and Fincher being a music video guy. But then it became this idea of like, okay, who's like the cool new young talent we can pick out of, semi obscurity to direct something. And that's where you get Jean-Pierre Jeunet, who was, of course, a big deal in Europe, but American audiences really weren't too familiar with him. And since then, that's kind of been the idea, right? Like Fede Alvarez being a wonderful director who had done a couple of features that were successful, but not like, household name successful, being picked, to do it. But again, in his case, it became this idea of like, oh, I love Alien so much, I really want to do justice to it. And I think we see that when you choose somebody like that, what you end up with is something that feels very much like it's not going to upset the apple cart of what Alien can encompass. It did make a lot of money though, right? So then again, you get this idea of like, would you rather make a lot of money, or would you rather have something that really, kind of shits on audiences a little bit, but makes us look within ourselves a little more deeply for meaning? And again, maybe I'm setting up this false dichotomy, but I think that Alien 3 gave us this idea that like an alien film should not feel like one thing. Like an alien film should not feel like it's just, a person in a ship, or like it's just colonial marines going onto a base. It could feel like whatever the person making it or the people making it would like to express philosophically at that given point in time. In a way, I mean, Resurrection was still that. I mean, like as much as we shit on, Joss's script, which I think we should, it was kind of speaking to the time in the late 90s where, cloning and, genetic engineering were big, topics of conversation and things like that. There was a sense of time and place for that, right? But Alien 3 really, I think it just changed what we expect out of an alien film in a way that I think we are still grappling with. I mean, if you look at the sequel to Romulus, right? Every time a new director is rumored to be attached to it, we, look them up and we see that they've talked about Alien in the past as being like their favorite thing or one of their favorite movies or something they're really passionate about. And then I start having this sense of like, oh, it's great because like they're quote unquote one of us. But also like Fincher was not one of us when he made Alien 3. Like Fincher was just trying to make a name for himself in Hollywood as a 20 something, and he took the job and had a lot to prove. And part of me wonders if we could use a little more, Alien 3 today in terms of alien films where we have somebody who is not afraid of upsetting people's expectations and does something that really just kind of challenges us to redefine what Alien is.
Again, agreed on all counts. What's coming to my mind right now, and as the premise of the show is, was Alien 3 a mistake? Here's where I think the mistake is. I don't think Alien 3 was a mistake. If anything, I don't even know if this conversation is about Alien 3 being a mistake. I think the mistakes happening post Alien 3, what are we, 33 years out from, yeah, 33 years out from the release of that film. The mistake in maybe not in retrospect, but like looking ahead, is that we have had films that aren't about anything. Whereas we have three films clearly about something. At the end, it becomes about Ripley's journey. Aliens is her journey full on, and Alien 3 is her journey essentially ended. And then you have Alien Resurrection, which kind of is about a different version of Ripley, but it's a whole different 200 years later. It's not even within like the window that we can say, oh, these events interrupt or intersect with these events here. It's just a film that it exists on its own, that doesn't need a sequel or whatever. But I think what we grapple with in terms of watching alien films today, watching Romulus, watching Alien Earth, is these films have everything that we've seen before without being what those films were in the, uh, you know, about, let me say that again. With Alien Romulus, probably Alien Covenant, and elements of Prometheus, and certainly Alien Earth, there are things that we can identify as alien things. Facehuggers, chestbursters, eggs, running from point A to point B, terror, all of those things that fit well within the alien kind of sandbox. But largely what those films lack are, what are they about? We don't know what they're about. On its face, Prometheus is about who made us and those interesting philosophical questions. I love those questions. I love I love asking questions better than I love the answer to them because oftentimes the answer aren't as fulfilling. I think we are creatures of questions. We question our nature. We question who we are. That's why Blade Runner lives so well within me and us is because it's that constant who are we? And those films make us better people. Alien, those original films, and definitely elements of what's come after are films that make me better people. I am who I am today because I've had these films in my life for so long. And I think the magnifying glass needs to be turned towards what are these films about? What is this show's about? And I want to stay on our topic here. I don't want to veer off, but I also think that what I struggle with shows like Alien Earth is even though they talk about like transhumanism and things like that, I still don't know what those shows are about. I don't know what Alien Earth is about. It's not, it deals with some loss, it deals with some transhumanist things, but it's I don't know what the show's about. I don't really know what the story is. And if anyone can clarify to me what they think the story is, I'd love to hear it. And me grappling with that issue is the issue. Um, in retrospect, after watching Alien Earth, I'm coming to love Romulus more, only because of the nostalgia, and it feels a little bit more like home. But Romulus also struggles with what it's about. It knows what it's about in the beginning, and then when it gets to the space station, it doesn't know what it's about. It's just set piece. Oh, face hugger. Oh, escape. Oh, chest burster. This happens. This comes from the cocoon. This then you got to do this, and there's a race, and there's a clock ticking. You got to everything that we've seen before. It's a film that just turns into one big callback, different in a different way, but it's just one big callback. And hey, it worked financially. It was a boon. It was great. It was great for the IP, but the question still remains: what are these things about? And I think Alien 3 was very clearly about something. And the mistake of Alien 3 wasn't the film or the story, it was the way they handled the deaths. And I think in my, that's where I'm coming from right now. I think the deaths were just fumbled.
Interesting. Yeah, I think it's funny because we kind of flipped on this a little bit. Like I think Romulus is really not about anything. I think Romulus is just like a fun, cool, scary, well-made alien film. But I don't think it's really expressing anything deeper about like the human condition. Whereas I think Alien Earth expresses a lot of deep things about the human condition. To me, Alien Earth is the story. It's a story about like who we actually are on the inside. It's about, in an age where we have, AI everywhere infecting everything that we do, and we live through these avatars of ourselves on social media, and we have become so abstracted in that way, like what's actually on the inside and like what's actually us anymore. And I think, but I mean, we're a little different in this, but I think Alien Earth deals with that beautifully. To me, like the stumblings in Alien Earth are not related to what it's about. It's about the execution of some of the ideas and some of the creature stuff, et cetera, which we've already talked about. But yeah, anyway, I think what's worth pointing out though is like the three original trilogy films were each about something through the lens of a specific character, right? I feel like we lose that a little bit as we go on, where like there's a great movie within Resurrection about what this means for Ripley 8, right? About this idea, right? There's a post or a transhumanist thing going on there, right? Like with what this would have been. And there's like little intimations of it in the film. Like there's these little moments where it feels like Genet wants to like take us there, but he kind of comes back from it a little bit. Um, but the original trilogy, it's like very clearly what it's about. The original trilogy is literally beginning, middle, and end. It is so cohesive. It is Ripley is introduced to trauma, Ripley triumphs over the trauma, and then Ripley is subsumed by the trauma in the end, or she's subsumed with the trauma. That's it, right? You can bring it out a little bit and say the first film is about a struggle against adversity, the second film is about triumph over adversity, and the third film is about making peace with adversity. Maybe that's another way to look at it. But I think that there's this real economy of idea in those films, right? Where it's not about like, oh, transhumanist stuff or these kind of, relatively highfalutin concepts. It's really ultimately about a character experiencing things that we can all really relate to in a very direct, visceral way, literally visceral way. In that, we all know what it's like to have to barrel through something really difficult and come out the other side of it or not. We struggle in our lives with illness, with terminal diagnoses, with difficult job things, with kids getting sick, with things that are very scary, and trying to find meaning in that experience and trying to find a way through it. And those part of why the original trilogy I think is still so universal is because those are just universally experienced things that humans have dealt with since the beginning of time. And I think part of why Alien 3 is not a mistake is it is dealing with the by far least sexy aspect of that whole thing, right? Which is endings. We are horrible, and I say this all the time in the show, as a species at grappling with and expressing the endings of anything, whether that be, death, whether that be the ending of our time with a character, whether that be the ending of a story. We just don't like it. We always want doors left open. Everybody would love, I mean, it would be so easy, right, had Alien 3 happened, where, Newt and Hicks survive, for them to have just been, kind of sidelined for the whole film, like say, in Cryo or something, and then for the film to have ended with like, the timer on Newt's pod going off and like her waking up or something. Like, I mean, that would have been such a bigger hit with audiences, and I'm sure we would have had much more financially straightforward, successful films after that, starring Newt and Hicks or something, right? But the truth is Alien 3 doesn't give us any of that. Alien 3 starts with incredibly unceremonial deaths, which is unfortunately, in the grand scheme of the universe, how all human death really is. And then it gives us the death of the character that we love so much at the end of the film. And in doing that, I think gives a lot of meaning to her journey, especially. So yeah, I mean, I don't think that Alien 3 is a mistake. I just think it's a really, really difficult film, and it's something that subsequent generations of filmmakers haven't really known how to address.
Yeah, and I think it also doesn't help that we have a studio that bypasses Alien 3, although to their credit, and recently you have a the Funko Pop. There's been like an Alien 3 Funko Pop, a couple of, and then there's this other Alien 3. I can't remember who makes it, but it shows, of course, Ripley cornered by the alien, that classic iconic pose. So there's been a little love thrown its way. Probably they're testing the waters to see who's interested, who's going to buy this. But you have a studio that has two studios now that has historically looked over it. They haven't made a book about the making of Alien 3 like they did with Alien and Aliens, pretending it doesn't exist. And I think that hurts the IP. It hurts the IP. It's like a family member you don't want to talk to because it made you angry. But in this case, it's a family member you don't want to talk to because it didn't make you money. If Alien 3, just the way it had been released, was a boon, it was a blockbuster, they would be talking about it. But because it didn't make any money and it was controversial, they don't invest in it. They don't make any books about it. You can't really, it's rare that you can get anything that's related to Alien 3 that's official. There's not a 4K, there's not a re-release. It's as if it doesn't exist in some ways, despite the steps they've been taking towards it recently. And I think that's a disservice to it. And I think when studios treat their the films that they own that way, it also sends a message to the audience. And I think to your point, you're talking about how humans deal with endings, but I think maybe at least how I'm perceiving it is humans dealing with change. Humans don't like change. But even though change is here to stay, change is the only certainty in the lives that we live. I mean, we will always, like, every moment of every day, there's going to be something that's changing. Every moment of every day. And that's something that I struggle with. And I think, yeah, I don't think it's a mistake at all. Again, I think the mistake of Alien 3 is how studios have let that film dictate what they do in the future. They're so afraid of Alien 3. They're so afraid of making those mistakes. That's all they do is make those mistakes. Now, we can have conversations on Alien Earth and the fumbles there. And I think you and I are pretty aligned on what's good is good and what's problematic is problematic. For people, someone like me, what's problematic in Alien 3 derailed my interest in or I'm sorry, what's problematic in Alien Earth derailed my interest in the show. It was that problematic when you treat something that is sacred and holy like it's a toy, like it's some toy, in the grass somewhere. To me, it becomes betrayal. Even though I know betrayal wasn't the point, that's how I read it. But I also understand that people view Alien 3 as the same. It's the same way. The death of these characters, the way that they died beforehand, no, nothing. All we see is mangled bodies, and then a body who goes through an autopsy of a little
Of a
girl.
child. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a betrayal too. I can completely see that as a betrayal. And like
I mean,
how you're like,
imagine that coming out today. Can you imagine the
I
internet?
can't. Yeah.
Could you
And
picture that? Like, oh
yeah,
my God.
yeah, for sure. For sure. It's interesting though, unrelated to what we're saying, but I definitely think with all of the cries of woke and everything, if Alien the trilogy was today, people would be like, especially Aliens with Vasquez and Ripley, and like people would be like, "What's this woke garbage?" The same people who love those films, some of the same people, will turn around to other films starring women today and go, "This is woke trash," which I think is really funny because it's like in the 80s and 90s it was okay, but now it's not. Anyways, it's a fodder for a different story. But I really think the future lies in how the studios connect with those films. I think what I loved about Romulus, and I think that there's you to your point, you're saying that you don't feel like Romulus is about anything, and I think again the second half I would have completely agreed. And I think Rain and her life on that planet on Jackson Star was gripping. It was different. We had a
I agree with
different
that. Yeah,
yeah, and
absolutely.
we had a different into the Weyland-Yutani like timeline, like life working for the company in a way we've never seen before. We've never seen a well, unless you count the special edition of Aliens, we've never seen aside from that, we've never seen like tons of people living on a colony funded or founded by Weyland-Yutani. That was great. That was new. Um, and it was
Agreed.
really a
Agreed 100%.
yeah,
Yeah. And I think that's
and that
part of
was
why
really
that part of the movie is so special to all of us, you know.
yes,
Yeah.
100%. And then it's again when she goes to the station, it becomes she's got to do this. This has to happen. This has to happen next. Oh, we got to retread, don't breathe. People want to see that there too. It just becomes this device of set piece, set piece, set piece, scare, scare, blood. It it stops being about something and just be it becomes by the numbers member berries. That's all that film ended up being as member berries. Although I do really enjoy it more than I enjoy Alien Earth, not because of what was in Alien Earth was different that I didn't like. It just felt like it knew what it was a little bit more. But I also don't like the comparison game. They're also very different things. They're
I think they're
very different
extremely
approaches.
different. Yeah.
Like you can't even like they're in episode 5 of Alien Earth, you were back on an Nostromo, you know, the Maginot. We're back on a very Nostromo like ship. It's as alien as anything is aside from Alien. You know, it's gorgeous. It looks wonderful. It's just unfortunately the writing was terrible. Um, but I think the future is learning from your mistakes, and as you know, the the title of this episode is how do we learn from our mistakes? And I don't think we have a studio that's learned from its mistakes. It wants to not make the same mistake, and it's so bent on that. There's so many fingers in the pie of not making mistakes that that's all they end up doing. And again, I don't want to be a gatekeeper. This is my opinion. These are what I think. And I'm always processing. I'm always kind of thinking about new things in new ways. And I love to be challenged as well. But that's kind of where I'm at right now with this.
Yeah, I mean, I agree very much that the mistake of Alien 3 is the studio's inability to reckon with it and to take the right lessons from it, you know. I think that's something that we're still dealing with, even though Romulus has wonderful things in it and Alien Earth has wonderful things in it. And the prequels, as you know, I adore Covenant, and Prometheus has a lot of great things too. There's we have a long, complicated history with Alien 3, and I do think that part of the mistake of it is that the studio has misinterpreted its lack of immediate success as a detriment, as opposed to maybe a good indicator that like taking chances can have long-term rewards, especially within fandoms. You know, like Alien 3, to your point, went from being something that seemed to be kind of universally hated for a time to something that, you know, a lot of us who did love it when it came out are now joined by many other people who have come over, you know, the ensuing decades to also love it and see the poetry in it and to find a lot of beauty in that film. We have to wrap because we have something kind of exciting coming out in just a minute on our social media. So check that out. And I also want to do a quick thank you, Christian Perez, for reminding me that Fireteam Elite 2 comes out tomorrow. So I will be playing that. I'm sure many of you will be playing it as well. And of course, we have lots of cool Alien Isolation stuff coming up from Gamescom and etc. Very soon. You'll be hearing a lot more about that. But we got to wrap because we got to do something potentially related to that very game in just a second. And before we do, I want to give quick shout outs to our producers. So I'm going to do that right now. Our producers are, all right, we got Xander House, Nathan Gribble, Darren Gold, Murray Kucherawi, Jonas Holmsten, David Holmes, Dave Turner, Gene McDonald, Perry Chicos, Matt Bro, Carl McLean, Joseph Rosner, Blood Hut, Steve Patterson, G. Latoya Yates, Arnold Quigley, Ross Yost, Pop Cycle, Jeff DeLoff, Carl Hinks, Chris B., Jeremiah White, Andrew, Peter from Melbourne, Gary Smith, Angel Cruz, Wayland Yutani, Distinguished Engineer, Lazy Pancreas, Sky Errand, Jordan, Darren, Eric Poopvane Stevens, Ali Kara, Matt Thomas, Andrew Tracy, Larry Wood, and Big Hippie. Thank you all so much for joining at the producer tier, and thank you
Thank
to
you.
all of our patrons, all of our listeners, all the people in the chat.